A widow's pride meets a rancher's quiet kindness when hunger forces impossible choices. But sometimes the hardest gifts to accept are the ones that come without strings attached. In the harsh beauty of Wyoming territory, two broken souls discover that mercy doesn't always look like what you expect. Sarah McKenna unwrapped the tiny blanket from around her daughter's shoulders, her hands trembling not from the autumn cold, but from what she was about to do. The wool was soft, hand-knitted by her mother before consumption took her last winter, dyed the palest blue with berries. Sarah had picked herself during happier times when Thomas was still alive, and their small homestead felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. Little Emma, barely 8 months old, gurgled softly as the morning air touched her thin cotton dress, and Sarah's heart clenched so hard she thought it might stop altogether. "Please," Sarah whispered to Henrik Olsen, the baker whose flour-dusted apron couldn't hide the hardness that had crept into his eyes over the past months as more and more desperate souls came to his door. "Just a loaf. She hasn't eaten since yesterday morning, and my milk." Sarah's voice broke. Her milk had been drying up for weeks now, her own body too starved to sustain both herself and the child. "I'll work it off. I can clean, I can." "Work don't put flour in my barrels or coal in my ovens," Henrik interrupted, but his voice held no cruelty, only the weariness of a man who'd heard too many stories like hers. He took the blanket anyway, running his thick fingers over the delicate stitches. "This might cover half a loaf, maybe less." Half a loaf. Sarah closed her eyes and nodded, because half a loaf meant Emma might live another day, and another day meant hope, even if she couldn't see what that hope might look like beyond tomorrow's sunrise. She watched Henrik disappear into the back of his shop, the blanket, her mother's final gift, Emma's only protection against the coming winter, clutched in his weathered hands. That's when she felt eyes on her. Not the judgmental stares of the townspeople who whispered about the widow McKenna and her dead husband's debts, but something different. Something that made her spine straighten despite her exhaustion. She turned slowly and found herself looking into the face of Jacob Thornfield, the rancher who owned more land than any 3 men needed, and whose cattle had made him rich enough to buy and sell the entire town of Cedar Falls twice over. Jacob stood near the bakery window, hat in his hands, silver-streaked hair catching the morning light. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, not pity exactly, but something deeper. Something that made her cheeks burn with shame because she knew what she must look like. Dress patched and repatched, boots held together with strips of leather, holding a baby whose ribs showed through her thin skin. "Mrs. McKenna," Jacob said quietly, stepping closer. His voice was rough like gravel roads but gentle in a way that surprised her. She'd heard stories about Jacob Thornfield, how he'd built his empire from nothing, how he was fair but hard, how he'd never married because he was married to the land instead. She'd never spoken to him directly, though she'd seen him in town plenty of times, always dressed in clothes that spoke of money earned honestly and kept carefully. "Mr. Thornfield." Sarah shifted Emma higher on her hip, the baby's weight feeling heavier with each passing moment. "I didn't see you there." "Hard not to notice when someone's trading away their winter for today's bread," Jacob replied, and there was no judgment in his voice, only a quiet observation that made Sarah's throat tight. Before she could respond, Henrik emerged from the back with half a stale loaf wrapped in brown paper. "Best I can do," the baker said, handing over the bread. "Blanket might be worth more come winter, but bread's worth more right now." Sarah nodded and took the loaf, feeling its weight, so small for such a large sacrifice. Emma began to fuss, her tiny fists waving in the air, and Sarah knew she needed to get home quickly to soak pieces of bread in water for the baby to suck on. It wasn't proper food for an infant, but it was what she had. "Thank you," she whispered to Henrik, then turned to go. But Jacob stepped into her path, not blocking her exactly, but making it clear he had something to say. "Walk with me, Mrs. McKenna," he said, and it wasn't quite a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. Something in between that made Sarah hesitate. She looked around the street, noting the way conversation stopped when people saw her talking to Jacob Thornfield, the way curtains twitched in windows as neighbors tried to get a better look. "I should get home," Sarah said carefully. "Emma needs to eat." "She does indeed," Jacob agreed, settling his hat back on his head. "Question is whether she'll have anything to eat tomorrow or the day after that." His eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held her steadily. "Your husband left debts." It wasn't a question. Sarah's face burned hotter. Of course he knew, everyone in Cedar Falls knew. Thomas had been a dreamer, full of plans for expanding their small farm, for buying better seed, for building a future that would stretch beyond the horizon. The consumption that took him had been cruel in its timing, striking just as those dreams had started to crumble under the weight of reality and borrowed money. Yes, Sarah said simply, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. I'm working to pay them. Taking in washing and mending. Jacob's voice was neutral, but something in his tone made Sarah's chin lift defensively. Honest work is honest work, Mr. Thornfield. Didn't say it wasn't. Jacob glanced at Emma, who had gone quiet again, her small face pale against Sarah's shoulder. Question is whether honest work pays enough to keep you both alive through winter. The blunt words hit Sarah like cold water. She knew the answer, had been avoiding thinking about it for weeks now. Her washing brought in barely enough to buy flour and beans. The mending earned her a few cents here and there. But winter was coming, and with it the need for firewood, for warmer clothes Emma was rapidly outgrowing, for more food as the cold drained strength from both their bodies. We'll manage, Sarah said, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Jacob studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her careful composure to the terror underneath. Then, without warning, he stepped closer and did something that made Sarah's heart stop altogether. He removed his hat, a fine black Stetson that probably cost more than Sarah had seen in 6 months, and placed it gently on Emma's tiny head. The hat was enormous on the baby, sliding down to cover her eyes and making her look like a doll playing dress-up. Despite everything, Sarah felt her lips twitch towards something that might have been a smile. Emma gurgled happily and reached up with one small hand to bat at the hat's wide brim. Looks good on her, Jacob said solemnly, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or fear, and everything to do with the unexpected kindness of strangers. Sarah reached up to lift the hat from Emma's head, but Jacob's hand closed gently over her wrist, stopping her. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, and the touch sent an unexpected jolt through Sarah that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. Keep it, Jacob said quietly. Hat like that's got more use keeping a baby warm than sitting on an old rancher's head. I can't, Sarah started, but Jacob was already stepping back, his hand falling away from her wrist. Course you can. Hat's mine to give, isn't it? There was something almost challenging in his voice, as if he was daring her to argue with his logic. Besides, looks like she's already claimed it. Emma had indeed grabbed hold of the hat's leather band with both tiny fists and was showing no signs of letting go. Her small face was more animated than Sarah had seen it in days, brown eyes bright with curiosity as she explored this new treasure. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice giving way to the first warm day of spring. Mr. Thornfield, Sarah began, but he was already turning away, striding toward the hitching post where a magnificent bay horse waited patiently. Jacob, he called over his shoulder. Name's Jacob, and you might want to get that little one home before she decides to eat my hat for breakfast. Sarah watched him mount his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd been born in the saddle, and for a moment she forgot about the bread in her hands, forgot about the debts and the winter coming and all the impossible choices that lay ahead. She just watched Jacob Thornfield ride away and wondered what had just happened between them. Well, I'll be damned. Henrik's voice startled her out of her reverie. The baker was standing in his doorway, flour still dusting his hands, staring after Jacob's retreating form with an expression of pure amazement. Never seen anything like that in all my years. Like what? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Jacob Thornfield giving away his hat. Henrik shook his head slowly. Man's worn that same hat for 15 years, ever since he came to Cedar Falls with nothing but a horse and a handful of dreams. Heard tell his daddy gave it to him before he died, told him it would bring him luck. Henrik's eyes moved to Emma, who was still clutching the hat with determined little fingers. Never seen him take it off except in church, and even then he keeps it right beside him on the pew. Sarah's stomach dropped. A family heirloom. She tried again to lift the hat from Emma's head, but the baby's grip tightened and she let out a cry of protest that echoed off the buildings around them. Several passers-by turned to look, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks again. I have to give it back, Sarah said, more to herself than to Henrik. I can't keep something like that. Might not have a choice, Henrik replied with a knowing look. That baby's got the look of someone who knows what she wants, and Jacob Thornfield's got the look of a man who don't give gifts he expects returned. The words followed Sarah home to her small cabin at the edge of town, a place that had once felt cozy and full of promise, but now seemed to shrink a little more each day as the walls closed in around her mounting problems. She heated water over the fire and soaked pieces of bread until they were soft enough for Emma to gum, all while the baby sat in her makeshift high chair, really just a wooden crate with a cushion tied inside, wearing Jacob's enormous hat and looking like the tiniest cowgirl in all of Wyoming territory. The hat kept sliding down over Emma's eyes, and each time Sarah pushed it back up, the baby would laugh, a sound so pure and sweet that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time she'd heard Emma laugh? When was the last time she'd had reason to laugh herself? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah's heart jumped, and she quickly scooped Emma up, hat and all, before going to see who it was. Through the small window, she could see Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm, her face pinched with the kind of disapproval that had become all too familiar since Thomas's death. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said as she opened the door, trying to keep her voice steady and polite. "Is it?" Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes immediately fixed on the hat adorning Emma's head, and her eyebrows rose nearly to her graying hairline. "My goodness, Sarah, that's quite an interesting choice of headwear for a baby." Sarah felt her defenses rise. Emma was cold. Cold enough to warrant Jacob Thornfield's hat. Mrs. Patterson stepped uninvited into the cabin, her gaze sweeping over the sparse furnishings, the mended quilts, the obvious signs of poverty that Sarah had tried so hard to hide. "Half the town saw you talking with him outside Henrik's bakery. People are beginning to wonder about the nature of your friendship." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. "There is no friendship, Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Thornfield was simply being kind to a child." "Kind?" Mrs. Patterson repeated the word like it tasted sour. "Is that what we're calling it? A man doesn't give away a hat like that without expecting something in return, Sarah. Surely you know that." Sarah's hands tightened around Emma, who seemed to sense the tension in the room and began to fuss. Mr. Thornfield expected nothing. He saw a cold baby and he saw an opportunity. Mrs. Patterson's voice was sharp now, cutting. "You're a young widow with debts and no means of support. He's a wealthy man with certain needs. The math isn't difficult, dear." The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, thick and choking. Sarah felt something wild and desperate clawing at her chest, not just anger, but a kind of fury she'd never experienced before. How dare this woman who lived comfortably on her husband's prosperous farm, who'd never known the gnawing fear of watching her child grow thinner each day, how dare she come into Sarah's home and poison the first act of genuine kindness Sarah had received in months? "Get out," Sarah said quietly. Mrs. Patterson blinked in surprise. "Excuse me." "Get out of my house." Sarah's voice was still quiet, but there was steel beneath it now, the kind of strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. "And don't come back unless you have something useful to offer instead of gossip and judgment." For a moment, Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely shocked. Then her face hardened into the familiar mask of righteous indignation that Sarah had come to know so well from the women of Cedar Falls. "I was trying to help you, Sarah, to warn you before you make a mistake that ruins what little reputation you have left." "My reputation is my concern," Sarah replied, moving to hold the door open, "as is my daughter's welfare. Good day, Mrs. Patterson." The older woman drew herself up to her full height, her lips pursed like she'd bitten into something bitter. "You'll regret this pride of yours, Sarah McKenna. Mark my words. Pride goeth before a fall, and you've got farther to fall than most." Sarah closed the door firmly behind her unwelcome visitor and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Emma had grown quiet again, her small fingers still tangled in the hatband, and when Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, she saw something there that hadn't been present in weeks: contentment. Despite everything, despite the hunger and the cold and the whispered rumors, Emma looked peaceful wearing Jacob Thornfield's hat. That afternoon, Sarah found herself standing at the window more often than usual, looking out toward the road that led to the Thornfield ranch. She told herself she was watching for customers who might need washing or mending done, but the truth was more complicated. Mrs. Patterson's ugly words kept echoing in her mind, mixing with her own confused feelings about Jacob's unexpected kindness. What did he want? What did anyone want when they gave gifts to desperate widows? But every time doubt crept in, Sarah would look at Emma, still wearing the hat, still smiling when it slipped down over her eyes, and remember the way Jacob had looked at them both. There had been no calculation in his gaze, no predatory assessment of her vulnerability, just a quiet recognition of need and the simple human impulse to meet it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. She wrapped Emma in her thinnest shawl, the only one she had left, and stepped out into the evening air. The walk to the Thornfield ranch would take nearly an hour, but she needed to know. Needed to look Jacob in the eye and understand what his gift meant before the gossip mill ground her reputation into dust. The road stretched ahead of them, dusty and rutted from the summer's wagon traffic, and with each step Sarah took, the weight of Jacob's hat seemed to grow heavier on Emma's small head. But the baby didn't complain. If anything, she seemed to relish the adventure, her bright eyes taking in the changing landscape as they left the familiar streets of Cedar Falls behind and entered the vast expanse of open range that belonged to Jacob Thornfield. By the time they reached the gates of the ranch, full darkness had fallen, and lamplight glowed warm and yellow in the windows of the big house that sat like a promise on the hill ahead. Sarah paused at the gate, suddenly uncertain. What if Mrs. Patterson had been right? What if coming here alone, after dark, with Jacob's hat on her baby's head, was exactly the kind of mistake that would destroy whatever fragments of respectability she had left? But then Emma made a small, happy sound and reached up to pat the hat's brim, and Sarah remembered something her mother had told her long ago. Sometimes the biggest mistake is not taking the risk at all. Sarah pushed open the ranch gate, its hinges creaking in the still night air, and began the long walk up the winding drive toward the house. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel, and with each step her heart hammered harder against her ribs. What was she doing? A respectable widow didn't visit a bachelor rancher after dark, didn't walk uninvited onto his property with her baby in her arms. But respectability was a luxury Sarah could no longer afford, and desperation made its own rules. The house loomed larger as she approached, its windows glowing with warm light that spoke of comfort and security, things that felt as foreign to Sarah now as fairy tales. She could see movement behind the curtains, the shadow of a figure moving from room to room, and she almost turned back twice before finally reaching the wide front porch with its carved railings and rocking chairs that suggested a life of leisure she could barely imagine. Sarah raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Emma had fallen asleep during the walk, her tiny body relaxed against Sarah's shoulder, the oversized hat tilted at an angle that would have been comical if Sarah's heart wasn't beating so fast she thought it might wake the baby. Through the door she could hear the sound of boots on wooden floors, papers rustling, the low murmur of a man's voice. Was he talking to someone, or just to himself? Before she could lose her courage entirely, Sarah knocked. 3 quick raps that seemed to echo in the night air like gunshots. The sounds inside the house stopped abruptly, and Sarah heard footsteps approaching the door. Heavy, measured steps that spoke of a man comfortable in his own domain but cautious about unexpected visitors after dark. The door opened, and Jacob Thornfield stood silhouetted against the lamplight, still dressed in his work clothes but with his sleeves rolled up and his dark hair slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. His pale eyes found hers immediately, and Sarah saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been concern. "Mrs. McKenna," he said quietly, his gaze moving from her face to the sleeping baby in her arms. "Is everything all right?" Sarah's carefully rehearsed words abandoned her completely. Standing here in the warm glow of his doorway, looking at this man who had shown her more kindness in one morning than she'd received from her own neighbors in months, she felt all her defenses crumble at once. "I came to return your hat." Jacob's eyes moved to where his Stetson sat perched on Emma's small head, and something that might have been amusement tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Seems to me like it's found where it belongs." "No," Sarah said more firmly than she felt. "It's too valuable. Mrs. Patterson told me. She said it belonged to your father, that it was." "Mrs. Patterson needs to mind her own business," Jacob interrupted, and there was an edge to his voice that Sarah had never heard before. "What else did she tell you?" Sarah's cheeks burned. She couldn't repeat the ugly implications Mrs. Patterson had made, couldn't voice the suspicions that had driven her out into the night like a woman possessed. "She said people are talking. About us. About the hat." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. Then he stepped back from the door, opening it wider. "Come inside, Mrs. McKenna. It's cold and that baby shouldn't be out in the night air." "I shouldn't." "You walked an hour in the dark to return something that wasn't yours to return," Jacob said matter-of-factly. "Least I can do is offer you a cup of coffee and a warm place to sit before you walk back." Sarah hesitated, torn between propriety and the exhaustion that was beginning to seep into her bones. The walk had been longer than she'd expected, and Emma was growing heavier in her arms. The thought of trudging back to town in the dark, with only the thin shawl between them and the cold, made her shoulders sag. "Just for a few minutes," she said finally, stepping across the threshold into Jacob's home. The interior of the house was nothing like what Sarah had expected. She'd imagined something grand and imposing, all dark wood and expensive furnishings that spoke of wealth accumulated and displayed. Instead, she found herself in a comfortable front room that felt lived in rather than formal. Books lined the walls, their spines worn from handling. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and papers were scattered across a large desk that dominated one corner of the room. It was the home of a working man, not a showplace. "Sit," Jacob said, gesturing toward a leather chair near the fire. "I'll get that coffee." Sarah settled carefully into the chair, adjusting Emma so the baby remained comfortable in her arms. The heat from the fireplace felt like a gift, warming her chilled skin and making her realize just how cold she'd been. Emma stirred slightly but didn't wake, and Sarah found herself relaxing despite her nervousness. Jacob returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to Sarah before settling into the chair across from her. The coffee was strong and black, with just a hint of sweetness that made Sarah's empty stomach clench with sudden hunger. When was the last time she'd had real coffee, not the bitter chicory brew she made at home to stretch her meager supplies? "Now," Jacob said, taking a sip of his coffee and fixing her with that steady gaze, "tell me what Mrs. Patterson really said." Sarah stared into her mug, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. "She said a man like you doesn't give gifts without expecting something in return. She said people would talk, would think that I was—" Sarah's voice caught, and she couldn't finish the sentence. "That you were trading favors for charity," Jacob said bluntly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and when Sarah finally looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "And what do you think, Mrs. McKenna? Do you think I gave your daughter my hat because I expected something from you?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She studied his face, looking for any sign of the predatory calculation Mrs. Patterson had warned her about. Instead, she found only patience and something that looked almost like hurt. "No," Sarah said quietly, "I don't think that." "Then why are you here?" The simple question unlocked something in Sarah's chest, and suddenly the words came pouring out. "Because I'm scared. Because I don't know how to accept kindness anymore without wondering what it costs. Because my husband left us with nothing but debts and broken promises, and I'm drowning, Mr. Thornfield. I'm drowning, and when you put that hat on Emma's head, it felt like someone had thrown me a rope, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to hold on." The confession left her feeling raw and exposed, as if she'd stripped off all her carefully maintained defenses and stood naked in the firelight. Emma stirred in her arms, making small sleeping sounds, and Sarah pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of her child's skin. Jacob leaned forward in his chair, his coffee forgotten. "Mrs. McKenna, Sarah, look at me." Sarah raised her eyes to meet his, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not pity, not calculation, but something fiercer and more complicated, something that looked like recognition. "I came to this valley 15 years ago with nothing but a horse, a handful of silver dollars and my father's hat," Jacob said quietly. "I was running from something, same as you're running toward something. First winter nearly killed me. Would have, if it hadn't been for the kindness of strangers who had no reason to help a fool kid with more pride than sense." Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn by the rawness in his voice. Man named Samuel Creek found me half frozen in a snowbank outside town. Could have left me there, probably should have, considering I'd been nothing but trouble since I arrived. Instead, he took me to his cabin, fed me, let me work off the debt by mucking out his stables and mending his fences. Jacob's eyes grew distant, remembering. Saved my life, and when I tried to pay him back later after I'd made something of myself, you know what he told me. Sarah shook her head. He said, boy, you can't pay back kindness. You can only pass it on. Jacob's gaze returned to Sarah's face, intense and unwavering. That hat on your daughter's head, that's not charity, Mrs. McKenna. That's just me passing it on. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not painful but overwhelming in their simple truth. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely, determined not to break down in this man's living room. But Jacob must have seen them anyway, because his expression softened. You said you're drowning, he continued. Maybe that's true, but drowning people don't usually have the strength to walk 5 miles in the dark just to return something they think doesn't belong to them. Takes a different kind of person to do that. Takes someone with backbone. Emma chose that moment to wake up, blinking sleepily and making small fussing sounds. The hat had slipped down over one eye during her nap, and she reached up with tiny fingers to push it back, her movements making both Sarah and Jacob smile, despite the tension in the room. She likes it, Jacob observed. She does, Sarah agreed, adjusting the hat so it sat more securely. I think it makes her feel important. Smart baby, knows quality when she sees it. Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. You really don't want it back, do you? I really don't. Jacob stood and moved to the fireplace, bracing one hand against the mantel and staring into the flames. That hat's brought me 15 years of luck, Mrs. McKenna. Good land, good cattle, good years more often than bad ones. Maybe it's time for that luck to find someone who needs it more than I do. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. What if I can't live up to it? What if I'm not strong enough to be the kind of person who deserves that kind of luck? Jacob turned back to face her, and the firelight caught the silver in his hair, making him look younger and older at the same time. Strength isn't something you have or don't have, Sarah. It's something you find when you need it most. And from where I'm sitting, you've already found more of it than you know. The use of her first name sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest, and she realized that somewhere in the course of this strange evening, the careful distance between them had dissolved. They were no longer the wealthy rancher and the desperate widow. They were just two people who had found something unexpected in each other's company. But even as the thought formed, Sarah heard the echo of Mrs. Patterson's warnings, felt the weight of all the watching eyes and wagging tongues that would dissect every moment of this encounter. A respectable woman didn't sit in a bachelor's parlor after dark, didn't accept gifts from men who weren't her husband, didn't allow herself to feel the dangerous warmth that was spreading through her veins like honey. As if reading her thoughts, Jacob returned to his chair, deliberately placing more distance between them. I should get my horse ready to take you home. It's not safe for you to walk back alone. I can't, people will see. People will see a neighbor helping a neighbor, Jacob said firmly. Nothing more, nothing less. But even as he said the words, Sarah caught something in his expression that suggested he felt the same dangerous current running between them that she did. The knowledge should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a reckless kind of hope that had nothing to do with hats or luck or the kindness of strangers, and everything to do with the way Jacob Thornfield looked at her like she was something precious instead of something broken. The ride back to town passed in a silence that felt charged with unspoken words. Sarah sat side-saddle on Jacob's horse, Emma cradled securely in her arms, while Jacob walked alongside them, one hand resting on the horse's neck. The moon had risen full and bright, casting silver shadows across the landscape and making everything look like a scene from a dream. Every few minutes, Jacob would glance up at them, and Sarah would feel that same dangerous warmth curl through her chest, making her grateful for the darkness that hid her flushed cheeks. When they reached her small cabin, Jacob helped her down from the horse with gentle hands that lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary at her waist. Sarah felt the solid warmth of his touch through the thin fabric of her dress, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the individual lines around his eyes, could smell the mixture of leather and soap, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice to speak any louder. "Nothing to thank me for," Jacob replied, but his voice was rougher than usual, and Sarah wondered if he was feeling the same confusion of emotions that was making her heart race. Emma stirred in her arms and the spell was broken. Jacob stepped back, touching the brim of his hat, then stopping when he realized it wasn't there, a rueful smile crossing his face. "Guess I'll have to get used to that." "Jacob, Sarah began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. That she was grateful, that she was terrified, that she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her in the firelight. "I know," he said quietly, and somehow that simple acknowledgement was enough. "Good night, Sarah." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, leaving Sarah standing in her doorway with Emma in her arms and 1,000 questions swirling through her mind. As she watched his silhouette disappear into the darkness, she realized that everything had changed between them, and there was no going back to the careful distance they'd maintained before. The next morning brought more than just dawn. Sarah woke to find Mrs. Patterson standing on her porch again, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Reverend Morrison, his thin face set in lines of stern disapproval, and Mrs. Hartwell, the banker's wife whose opinion carried weight in all the social circles that mattered in Cedar Falls. "Sarah," Reverend Morrison said without preamble when she opened the door, "we need to talk." Sarah's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to stand straight, Emma balanced on her hip with Jacob's hat still perched on her small head. "Good morning, Reverend. Ladies, what can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining why you were seen riding home from the Thornfield Ranch at nearly midnight," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice sharp with accusation. "On Mr. Thornfield's horse, alone." So they knew. Of course they knew. In a town the size of Cedar Falls, secrets were harder to keep than water in a broken bucket. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting their judgmental stares with as much dignity as she could manage. "Mr. Thornfield was kind enough to escort me home after I returned something that belonged to him," Sarah said carefully. "Returned something?" Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Then why is that child still wearing his hat?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could answer, Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his expression grave. "Sarah, I've known you since you were a child in my congregation. I married you to Thomas, baptized your daughter. I don't want to believe what people are saying about you, but your behavior is making it very difficult to defend your reputation." "What are people saying?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "That you're trading your virtue for charity," Mrs. Hartwell said bluntly. "That you've set your cap for Jacob Thornfield and are using that child as bait to catch yourself a wealthy husband." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She clutched Emma tighter, feeling the baby's small body tense in response to her mother's distress. "That's not, I would never." "Then explain the hat," Mrs. Patterson demanded. "Explain why a man like Jacob Thornfield would give away a family heirloom to a woman he barely knows, unless he expected something in return." Sarah opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain about kindness and luck and the simple human impulse to help someone in need, but the words died in her throat. How could she make them understand something she barely understood herself? How could she explain the connection she'd felt with Jacob without making it sound exactly like what they were accusing her of? "I think," Reverend Morrison said gently, "that it would be best if you returned the hat and ceased all contact with Mr. Thornfield, for your own good and for the good of your daughter's future reputation." "Emma needs to eat," Sarah said quietly. "She needs clothes for winter, medicine when she's sick. My reputation won't keep her alive if we starve." "There are proper ways to seek help," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "The church has a fund for widows in need. You could apply for assistance through the proper channels." Sarah almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. She'd tried the proper channels, had spent weeks filling out forms and sitting in uncomfortable chairs in church offices, hat in hand, begging for scraps of charity that came with so many conditions and judgments attached that they felt more like punishments than help. "And what if the proper channels say no?" Sarah asked. "What if the fund runs out or the committee decides I'm not deserving enough? What then? Reverend Morrison's face softened slightly. Sarah, I understand that you're frightened. Widowhood is a difficult burden, especially with a young child, but compromising your moral character is not the answer. I haven't compromised anything, Sarah said, her voice stronger now, fueled by indignation. Mr. Thornfield showed kindness to my daughter, nothing more. Kindness, Mrs. Patterson repeated the word like it was something distasteful. Is that what we're calling it when a man invites a young widow into his home after dark, when he gives her expensive gifts and rides through the night with her in his arms? I was holding Emma, Sarah protested. We didn't, she stopped, realizing that anything she said would only make it sound worse. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward, her expression stern but not entirely unsympathetic. Sarah, dear, I know this is difficult to hear, but people are talking, and once talk starts in a place like Cedar Falls, it spreads like wildfire. Your reputation is all you have left to protect your daughter's future. Don't throw it away for a moment of foolish romance. Romance. The word made Sarah's cheeks burn because there was enough truth in it to sting. She had felt something for Jacob Thornfield, something that had nothing to do with his wealth or her desperation, and everything to do with the way he'd looked at her like she was worth seeing. But that didn't make it wrong, did it? What do you want from me? Sarah asked finally. Return the hat, Reverend Morrison said. Publicly. Make it clear that you have no designs on Mr. Thornfield beyond neighborly gratitude. Distance yourself from any appearance of impropriety. Sarah looked down at Emma, who had grown quiet during the confrontation but whose small fingers were still wrapped around the hatband, as if she understood that someone was trying to take it away. The hat was too big, too valuable, too much of everything Emma had never had and probably never would have again. But more than that, it represented something Sarah was afraid to name, the possibility that not all kindness came with strings attached, that not all men saw her as either a burden or an opportunity. And if I don't? Sarah asked. The three visitors exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Then I'm afraid the church will have to reconsider your membership, Reverend Morrison said sadly, and the Ladies' Aid Society will no longer be able to offer you work or assistance. The threat was clear. Comply or be cut off from the few sources of income and support she still had. Sarah felt the trap closing around her, felt the familiar weight of other people's expectations and judgments pressing down on her shoulders like stones. But then Emma made a small sound and reached up to pat Sarah's face with one tiny hand, and Sarah remembered what Jacob had said about strength being something you found when you needed it most. Maybe it was time to find out just how much strength she had. I'll think about it, Sarah said finally, which was not the immediate compliance they'd obviously expected. Reverend Morrison frowned. Sarah. I said I'll think about it, Sarah repeated, more firmly this time. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She stepped back and closed the door, leaning against it as she listened to the murmur of disappointed voices on her porch. Only when she heard their footsteps retreating did she allow herself to sink down onto her one remaining chair, Emma still clutched in her arms. The baby looked up at her with solemn brown eyes, as if sensing the gravity of what had just happened. Sarah touched the brim of Jacob's hat where it sat perched on Emma's small head, and for a moment she could almost feel the warmth of his hands, could almost hear his voice telling her that kindness couldn't be paid back, only passed on. But passing it on required courage, and Sarah wasn't sure she had enough of that particular currency to spend. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of the town beginning its day, horses and wagons, voices calling greetings, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Life going on as usual, while inside her small cabin, Sarah McKenna tried to decide whether she was brave enough to risk everything for the sake of a hat and the man who'd given it to her. The decision, she knew, would determine not just her future, but Emma's as well. And that knowledge made it both the most important choice she'd ever faced and the most terrifying. By afternoon, Sarah had made up her mind. She bundled Emma in her thinnest shawl again, settled Jacob's hat more securely on the baby's head, and walked into town with her shoulders squared and her chin held high. Let them talk. Let them stare and whisper and pass judgment. She'd spent too many months letting other people's opinions dictate her choices, and where had it gotten her? Hungry, desperate, and alone. She had business to conduct, and for the first time since Thomas died, Sarah McKenna was going to do it on her own terms. The first stop was Henrik's Bakery, where she walked in with Emma on her hip and placed 3 silver coins, her last 3 silver coins, on the counter. Henrik looked up from his ledgers, surprise flickering across his flour-dusted face. "Mrs. McKenna," he said carefully, "what can I do for you?" "I'd like to buy a loaf of bread," Sarah said. "Your best bread, and I'd like to pay full price for it." Henrik's eyes moved from the coins to the hat on Emma's head, and Sarah saw him make the connection. "Mrs. McKenna, if this is about the blanket—" "This is about paying my debts," Sarah interrupted, "all of them." She spent the rest of the afternoon making similar stops around town, using the last of her meager savings to settle accounts that had been weighing on her conscience for months. At each shop, she paid in full and stood tall, meeting curious stares with steady eyes and refusing to offer explanations she didn't owe. By evening, she was broke again, but for the first time in months, she felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. Emma had slept through most of the errands, lulled by the rhythm of walking and the warmth of the late afternoon sun, and now she was awake and babbling contentedly as they made their way home. They were almost to the cabin when Sarah heard hoofbeats behind them. She turned to see Jacob approaching on his bay horse, and her heart did something complicated in her chest that was part relief, part joy, and part pure terror. He dismounted when he reached them, his expression unreadable in the gathering twilight. "Heard you had some visitors this morning." Sarah nodded, suddenly unsure of her voice. "Heard they had some opinions about my hat." "They did." Sarah's voice came out steady, which surprised her. Jacob studied her face in the dim light, and Sarah wondered what he saw there. "What did you tell them?" Sarah took a breath, feeling as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump without knowing if there was water below or only rocks. "I told them I'd think about it." Something shifted in Jacob's expression. "And what did you decide?" Sarah reached up and adjusted the hat on Emma's head, her fingers lingering on the soft leather band. The baby gurgled happily and grabbed for Sarah's hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "I decided," Sarah said quietly, "that some things are worth fighting for." The words hung between them in the evening air, weighted with meanings that neither of them spoke aloud. Jacob stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the way the last light caught the silver in his hair, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Even if it costs you everything?" he asked. Sarah looked down at Emma, then back up at Jacob, and felt something settle into place in her chest, not resignation but resolution. "What's everything worth if you lose yourself to keep it?" Jacob's face transformed with a slow smile that made Sarah's knees weak. "That," he said softly, "is exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Jacob's smile faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by something more serious, more determined. "Sarah, there's something you need to know, something I should have told you last night." The gravity in his voice made Sarah's stomach clench with sudden fear. "What is it?" "Your husband's debts," Jacob said quietly. "I bought them." The words hit Sarah like cold water. She stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he just said. "You what?" "3 months ago, when the bank was about to foreclose on your cabin, I bought Thomas's debts, all of them." Jacob's pale eyes never left her face, watching for her reaction. "The mortgage, the seed loans, the equipment notes, everything." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I couldn't stand watching you lose everything because of another man's mistakes," Jacob said simply. "Because I've been where you are, and I know what it feels like to have the ground disappear from under your feet." Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted Emma's weight in her arms. The baby sensed her mother's distress and began to fuss, but Sarah barely heard her. "So what does that mean? What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Jacob said firmly. "You owe me nothing, Sarah." "That's not, you can't just—" Sarah struggled to find words for the storm of emotions churning through her. Gratitude, terror, confusion, and underneath it all, a growing sense of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this," Jacob replied, stepping closer. "I knew you'd see it as charity instead of what it really is." "And what is it really?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to keep it level. Emma's fussing grew louder, and Sarah began to pace, bouncing the baby gently. It's an investment, Jacob said. In this town, in the people who make it worth saving. Your husband wasn't a bad man, Sarah. He was a dreamer who got in over his head, but his dreams weren't wrong. The land around your cabin is good land. The idea of expanding the farms, bringing in more families, that could work, given time and better management. Sarah stopped pacing and stared at him. So you bought my debts to get my land. I bought your debts to keep you from losing your land, Jacob corrected, his voice sharp with frustration. There's a difference. Is there? Sarah's voice was bitter now, all the fear and uncertainty of the past months crystallizing into anger. Mrs. Patterson was right, wasn't she? You don't give gifts without expecting something in return. You've been playing a longer game, that's all. Jacob's face darkened. If that's what you think of me, then you don't know me at all. I don't know you, Sarah exploded, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. I've spoken to you 3 times in 5 years, Jacob. 3 times. And now I find out you've been pulling strings behind my back, making decisions about my life without even asking me. How is that different from what Thomas did? The comparison hit Jacob like a physical blow. Sarah saw him flinch, saw something hurt flash through his eyes before his expression closed off. It's different because I'm not asking you to choose between your pride and your daughter's life. Aren't you? Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried more weight than any shout. What happens now, Jacob? What happens when the whole town finds out that the poor widow McKenna is beholden to Jacob Thornfield for everything she has? What happens to Emma's reputation then? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him wrestling with something, some decision that would change everything between them. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, extending it toward her. Take it, he said simply. Sarah shifted Emma to one arm and took the paper, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the legal language, struggling to make sense of the formal terminology. When understanding finally came, she nearly dropped the document. This is the deed to your land, Jacob confirmed. Free and clear. No debts, no liens, no obligations to anyone. Sarah stared at him in shock. I can't accept this. You already have, Jacob said quietly. I had the papers drawn up yesterday before the gossip started circling. It's done, Sarah. The land is yours, no strings attached. There are always strings attached, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction now. She looked down at the deed in her hands, at the legal language that meant security for Emma, meant a future that didn't depend on the charity of others or the judgment of the town. Not this time, Jacob said. This time it's just one neighbor helping another, nothing more, nothing less. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, and this time she didn't try to hold them back. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this? Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because 15 years ago, a man named Samuel Creek saved my life, and when I tried to pay him back, he told me kindness could only be passed on. Because I've watched you fight for your daughter with more courage than most men show on a battlefield. Because, he stopped, shook his head. Because it's the right thing to do. Sarah looked down at Emma, who had grown quiet again, her small fingers still wrapped around Jacob's hat. The baby looked up at her mother with solemn brown eyes, as if she understood the gravity of what was happening. What do you want from me, Jacob? Sarah asked finally. Nothing, he said immediately, then corrected himself. That's not true. I want you to be happy. I want Emma to grow up without the shadow of debt hanging over her head. I want you to make choices based on what you want, not what you're forced to accept. And if what I want includes you. The words slipped out before Sarah could stop them, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Jacob went very still. What are you saying? Sarah took a shaky breath, feeling as if she were stepping off another cliff. I'm saying that hat on Emma's head isn't the only thing I'm afraid to give back. I'm saying that when you look at me, I feel like someone worth looking at. I'm saying that I've been a widow for 8 months, and until you knocked on Henrik's door yesterday morning, I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope for something more than just surviving another day. The confession hung between them in the gathering darkness, raw and honest and terrifying. Jacob stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw a dozen emotions flicker across his face before settling into something that looked like wonder. Sarah, he said softly, stepping closer, Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to being just neighbors. The talk will get worse before it gets better. Let them talk, Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I'm tired of letting other people's opinions run my life. I'm tired of being afraid. Jacob reached up and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. I've been waiting 15 years for someone to look at me the way you're looking at me right now. How am I looking at you? Sarah whispered. Like you see something worth keeping, Jacob replied, and then he was kissing her, soft and careful and full of promise. The kiss lasted only a moment before Emma's sharp cry broke them apart, reminding them both that they were standing in the middle of the road where anyone could see them. But something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be taken back or explained away. Come to dinner tomorrow night, Jacob said, his hand still cupping her cheek. Both of you, let me cook for you properly in my kitchen where we can talk without the whole town watching. Sarah hesitated only for a moment before nodding. All right. And Sarah, Jacob's smile was crooked boyish. Bring the hat, it looks better on her than it ever did on me. As Jacob rode away, Sarah stood in the road holding Emma and the deed to her land, watching his silhouette disappear into the darkness. Around her, she could feel the town settling into sleep, windows glowing with lamplight, families gathering for evening meals, the comfortable routines of people whose lives followed predictable patterns. But Sarah's life was no longer predictable, and for the first time since Thomas died, that didn't terrify her. It excited her. She walked the rest of the way home with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the deed in her pocket, and everything to do with the memory of Jacob's kiss, the promise of tomorrow night's dinner, and the growing certainty that some risks were worth taking, no matter what the gossips might say. Inside the cabin, Sarah lit the lamp and sat down to study the legal document that had changed everything. The formal language couldn't hide the simple truth. She was free. Free from debt, free from the constant fear of losing her home, free to make choices based on hope instead of desperation. Emma babbled contentedly from her makeshift high chair, Jacob's hat still perched on her small head, and Sarah found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. The sound filled the small cabin like music, chasing away the shadows that had lived in the corners for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new gossip from neighbors who couldn't understand that sometimes kindness was exactly what it appeared to be. But tonight, Sarah McKenna was a woman with land of her own, a future she could shape, and the memory of a kiss that tasted like possibility. She fed Emma pieces of soft bread soaked in warm milk, singing quietly as the baby ate with more appetite than she'd shown in weeks. The hat kept slipping down over Emma's eyes, making her giggle and reach up to push it back into place, and each time she did, Sarah felt her heart swell with something that might have been joy. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding Sarah that winter was still coming, still bringing its own challenges and hardships. But for the first time since Thomas died, Sarah wasn't facing that winter alone. She had land that couldn't be taken from her, a man who saw her as more than her circumstances, and a daughter whose laughter filled the cabin with light. It was enough, more than enough, it was everything. 3 years later, Sarah Thornfield stood in the kitchen of the big house on the hill, flour dusting her apron as she rolled out dough for Emma's birthday cake. Through the window, she could see her daughter, now almost 4 and still wearing that same black hat, though Jacob had bought her 3 smaller ones that actually fit, chasing chickens around the yard while her father pretended to help, but mostly just laughed at her antics. The gossips had been wrong about almost everything, but they'd been right about one thing: people had talked. For months after Sarah and Jacob's wedding, tongues wagged about the speed of their courtship, the convenience of their arrangement, the scandal of a widow remarrying so quickly. But talk, Sarah had learned, was just noise, and noise eventually faded when people found new subjects to dissect. What hadn't faded was the way Jacob looked at her every morning when she woke up in his arms, like she was still something worth marveling at. What hadn't faded was Emma's delight in having a father who taught her to ride horses and carve wood, and believed that the world was full of adventures waiting for little girls brave enough to seek them out. The kitchen door opened, and Jacob came in carrying Emma, both of them covered in dust and grinning like conspirators. The hat sat tilted at its usual impossible angle on Emma's head, held in place now by a chin strap Jacob had fashioned from soft leather. "Mama," Emma announced importantly, "Papa says the cake needs to be chocolate, because I'm getting to be a big girl and big girls get chocolate cake on their birthdays." "Does Papa indeed?" Sarah raised an eyebrow at her husband, who had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "Papa may have mentioned that chocolate cake was his favorite when he was a little boy," Jacob admitted, setting Emma down and moving to wrap his arms around Sarah from behind. "Papa may also have mentioned that sharing birthday cake with beautiful women makes it taste even better." Sarah leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and soap, and the outdoors that always clung to his clothes. "Well, if Papa insists on chocolate cake, then chocolate cake it shall be." Emma clapped her hands in delight and ran off to play with the wooden horse Jacob had carved for her, the oversized hat bouncing with each step. Sarah and Jacob watched her go, and Sarah felt that familiar swell of gratitude for the path that had led them all here. "Any regrets?" Jacob asked quietly, his arms tightening around her. Sarah thought about the question seriously, as she always did when he asked it. Thought about the cabin at the edge of town that now served as a home for other families in need. Thought about the town's gradual acceptance of their marriage, the way even Mrs. Patterson had softened over time, especially after Jacob hired her husband to manage the expanded farming operations. Thought about the children she and Jacob hoped to have together, brothers and sisters for Emma, who would grow up wearing hand-me-down hats and believing that kindness was something you passed on instead of paid back. "Only one," Sarah said finally. "What's that?" Sarah turned in his arms, smiling up at the man who had saved her life by putting his hat on her daughter's head. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that accepting love isn't the same thing as losing yourself." Jacob's answering smile was worth all the gossip, all the judgment, all the fear she'd carried for so many months. "Good thing I'm a patient man." "Good thing indeed," Sarah agreed, and kissed him while their daughter's laughter echoed through the house like a promise that some stories, against all odds, really did end happily. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the scent of spring across the valley, and somewhere in town, a young widow knocked on a door, hoping for kindness. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, one hat and one act of courage at a time.